Senator Graham.
Thank you, Doctor. I definitely get where you're coming from. You see a lot of things that most people never see. Mayor, what percentage of violent deaths involving a firearm in your city are a result of handguns versus rifles? Do you know?
Thank you, Senator. In 2012, unfortunately, we had 331 murders in the city of Philadelphia. And pretty consistently over the last 10 years or so, murder has been committed with a gun or other handgun or rifle type of weapon, usually anywhere from 82 to 85% of the murders in Philadelphia are committed with a gun.
But you don't know of, just nationally, according to the 2011 numbers, 2.5% of homicides were committed with some form of a rifle. You think that's vastly different in Philadelphia? And I know you don't, I mean, I know.
Well, I do have some numbers, Senator. I think the thing, so I'm not going to talk about the national picture.
Yes, sir.
331 murders in Philadelphia last year, 282 were committed with a handgun, 2 with a shotgun. This year we've had 31 murders, which is actually 37% down year-to-date compared to last year, 25 with handguns, 2 with a shotgun, including, unfortunately, yesterday morning, Jennifer Fitzpatrick, 37 years old, mother of 4, was killed by her ex-boyfriend in front of her 4-year-old with a 12-gauge shotgun after chasing her down the street and shooting repeatedly after her. Right. So gun violence, certainly in Philadelphia, many of our major cities across the United States of America, I would only suggest, Senator, handgun, rifle, shotgun, dead is dead. Well, and that's what's being experienced in our cities all across America.
I couldn't agree with you more, but the reason we have hearings like this is try to paint the picture for America of the problem we're trying to solve.
Right.
And I don't know what percentage of deaths are caused by rifles in Philadelphia, but I know nationally it's 2.5%. Mr. Hardy, you've done some research on American ownership of the AR-15, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Under the Heller definition, do you think it would be a commonly used or a weapon in common use at the time?
Senator, I believe it would clearly be a weapon in common use at the time. The first bit of research I included was that approximately 22% of all American rifle production at the moment is devoted to the AR-15 platform. Excuse me, that's the minimum. Those are companies that only make AR-15s. Then you've got the other companies that make that plus some other arms.
Now, back to the background check. Chief Lynn, I think it's a very interesting observation that he's not into chasing paper. And I guess my point is, if you have 76,000 people fail a background check and only 13 people plead guilty, I'm not so sure we're sending the right signal to our citizens at large that we're really serious about you trying to get a gun illegally when you only have 13 guilty pleas out of 76,000. And here's a stunning number, Madam Chairman. 19% of the people who failed a background check were fugitives from justice. I mean, that's 13,862 people apparently in 2012 failed a background check because they were a fugitive from justice. And my point is that if we should be going after those folks. No matter how you feel about guns, we should be going after those folks. From a background check point of view, is this legislation, Mr. Hardy, that you understand, would it require a background check if I sold the gun to my neighbor?
I don't know that this bill specifically relates to that, but the proposals I have seen would say yes, you would be required to go through a dealer.
All right. Now, Ms. Adams, about self-defense, are you familiar with a case in Atlanta? I think it happened probably a month or two ago where a man entered the house with a crowbar, just gotten out of jail. The mother was at home with 2 twin daughters, I think. She took the daughters up to the second floor and hid in a closet. The intruder followed up and opened the closet door. She had a 6-shot revolver. She was on the phone with her husband. She emptied the gun, hit him 5 or 6 times, and he was able to get in his car and drive away. In a situation like that, would you object to the mother having a 20-round clip?
No. And I am familiar with it. I heard about it like many mothers and grandmothers. As a law enforcement officer, the question I had was if he followed them upstairs, sought them out when he had full access to any valuables downstairs, what was his intent?
Well, we'll never know what he was up to because it ended in a way where the family was safe. And we all agree that no one who is mentally unstable or criminal should have one bullet with any gun. And the whole point here is try to make sure that we balance keeping guns out of the hands of the wrong people without also recognizing the Second Amendment. I would suggest that in some situations, 6 bullets is not enough for a person defending their family, and 1 bullet in the hands of the wrong person is way too many. And that's what we're trying to accommodate here. Now, one last thing, and I'm trying to wrap this up. There's a debate about self-defense here, Mr. Hardy. If you had a lawless situation, let's say there's a natural disaster somewhere. Unfortunately, these things happen. There are 3 homes. There's a home without a gun, there's a home with a shotgun, and a home with an AR-15. If there's a gang roaming around the neighborhood, what home do you think is best protected in a situation like that?
I'd say in that situation, Senator, an AR-15, the one with the AR-15, but you don't even have to go to a hypothetical. I've been in a situation where you needed it. It's anywhere along the border. I live about 60 miles from the Mexican border. I was within 5 miles of the border with a rancher working on a court case. The rancher had a pistol, his wife had a pistol, I had a pistol, and he had an AR-15 in the car, and I felt distinctly underarmed. I mean, we only had one. If you encounter a drug cartel gang coming through, you're going to need more than that.
And I would just end this by saying that Vice President Biden has made the case, and I think he's very sincere, that to his wife, if you live in a wooded area, you got a double-barrel shotgun to ward off the bad guys, go outside and fire a couple of shots. And he also made the case to a gentleman from California, if there's a natural disaster, the shotgun is a preferred weapon over the AR-15 for self-defense. And I would just say that reasonable people can disagree on that. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. We must give up this room at 1:30, and we have 3 additional senators who would very much like ask questions. So I'd like to try to keep the timeline. And Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. I listened to the arguments on the other side at several hearings, and we heard them articulated specifically by one of the other senators in the earlier panel. And he said, let's not rush into this too quickly. 2 years ago, a member of the United States House of Representatives, one of our own, was shot point blank in the face in Tucson, Arizona. We didn't even hold a hearing on that. Don't rush into this too quickly. When you look at what's happening in city after city across the United States, we're not rushing into this too quickly. We're coming in too late for a lot of these victims. So I disregard that immediately. The second and third point made by some arguing against this effort, laws aren't going to solve all the problems. And many people will just disregard whatever we do. Well, I think we all concede that no law is going to solve all the problems. And even we realize even today people are speeding on highways despite laws saying they shouldn't. Does that mean we don't try? We don't make an effort at this? But the thing that bothered me the most was the argument is we have to take care and be careful to protect the rights of law-abiding citizens. To protect the rights of law-abiding citizens. Mr. Heslin, I walked into the room here when that video was on, and there were people up there using AR-15s, spraying targets with bullets. And flashed on the screen right after one of them was the word fun. And I thought about that. And I thought about your rights and Jesse's rights as a law-abiding citizen, to be safe in a schoolroom in Newtown, Connecticut. What about the rights of the law-abiding citizens who wear uniforms every day, the men and women in law enforcement who get up and put their lives on the line for us? What about their rights? Don't they have rights at least equal to these rights under the Second Amendment? I think that's what Heller said. Heller said this isn't an absolute right. And sadly, Professor Johnson, I've been through law schools a long, long time ago, and law professors can really kind of dance around the top of a head of a pin. But when I listen to you and Mr. Hardy describe the Second Amendment, it's a suicide pact. Because by your definition, what has become common in America is unacceptable in a civilized country. What has become common, what has been common in America...
I made a very different point, Senator.
I'll tell you what, the point I want to make is this. If it is common in America to have a military assault weapon with a 100-round magazine, if that is common for self-defense in America, God save this country.
I made a point about irrational classifications. Senator, could I respond?
Please do.
My point was actually that this legislation will make things worse on the measure of people who support it. That is, it cannot be sustained ultimately. The Supreme Court will look at these classifications.
So let's read what the Supreme Court said. Let's read what they said, Professor.
Can I finish?
Let's read exactly what they said. They said that the court held in Heller that the Second Amendment preserves access to firearms in common use and not dangerous or unusual.
And that last piece is exactly my point.
For the purpose of self-defense.
If it turns out that
Excuse me, sir. Are you arguing that the AR-15 that we just saw demonstrated there is a common weapon, not dangerous or unusual, used for the purpose of self-defense? Is that your argument?
That is not my argument, actually.
Well, then I can just tell you that you've been excluded by Heller. Please respond.
The point of this analysis, and I conducted this in 2009 before this issue arose, was that there is a necessity for creating a category of exceptionalism. If you claim that the AR-15 is exceptional, you have to show that its characteristics are not duplicated by items or guns that are in your other category of allowed weapons. And my point about the shotgun was that all of the claims that are made about the exceptional capacities of the AR-15 are better illustrated, better demonstrated actually by the shotgun. And if you go before the Supreme Court with that, what you will have ultimately is a piece of legislation that really just generates more demand for the very type of gun that you're trying to ban.
Professor,
and ultimately you're going to have the same failure that you had in 1994.
My time is running out, and I know lawyers and senators can speak at length. And I would just say this in conclusion. I believe this chairman has made a good faith effort. If you take a look at the number of weapons that are an exception to her categories here, there is no law-abiding sportsman or hunter or person who wants a gun for self-defense who will be left unarmed under the Second Amendment in Illinois or in any place in the United States.
Those guns are actually more deadly than the AR-15. That's the point.
The point I'm making here is there's ample opportunity for applying the Second Amendment, and the Heller Court said we can be reasonable in drawing these standards. And the last point I'll make, Representative Adams, this is not feel-good legislation. I'm sorry you used that phrase in your statement testimony. I don't feel good about being here today. Mr. Heslin doesn't feel good about being here today. We are trying to make this country safe, and we're giving our best efforts to do that.
And Senator, I understand as someone who has a husband on the wall at Judiciary Square, but I also understand that the criminals, by their very definition, do not obey the law. So when you take away the guns that people have to protect themselves, law-abiding citizens are left unarmed.
I'm sure you'll now support universal background check to keep the guns out of the hands of criminals, won't you?
No, sir, because that's a flawed system also. If you want to fix that system first, I would love to have an opportunity to discuss that with you.
Yeah, Senator Franken.
Professor Johnson, you know, I've argued some cases in the United States Supreme Court. In fact, defending state statutes in our state Supreme Court, I defended our assault weapon ban in Connecticut and won. It was upheld. The vast majority, in fact, I don't know of any court differing with the rulings made by federal courts on the assault weapon ban that existed before 2004, upheld it. Do you know of any decision by a United States District Court that strikes down an assault weapon ban?
Make a distinction between the pre-Heller world and now. So,
well, let me just ask the first question.
Yes.
Do you know of any decision striking it down?
No.
Do you know of a letter that was written by 50 constitutional law professors, including libertarian and conservative intellectuals like Robert Epstein, Eric Posner, Charles Fried, from the top law schools of the country, that say that restrictions on the manufacture and sale, and I'm quoting, and I ask that this letter be put in the record, Madam Chairman.
So ordered.
Restrictions on the manufacture and sale of high-capacity ammunition magazines and assault weapons are also consistent with the Second Amendment. Are you aware of that letter?
I'm aware of that letter, and I know many of the folks on that list, but I would venture that most of the people on that list have not spent more than a couple of hours thinking about this issue.
Well, I'm sure they would differ.
I've spent decades on this, and the assessment that I presented in 2009
Let me just ask another question.
is one that I'd urge you to read.
That I'm sure they would differ on the amount of time they spent thinking about this issue before they signed the letter. And
most of them haven't published on the issue.
okay, well, I'll let you settle the issue of their credentials academically.
It's not about their credentials, it's just about the amount, whether they've thought this through.
Okay. You know, with all due respect, Professor, in the arguments I've done before the United States Supreme Court defending state statute and sometimes the action of state officials, the first two propositions out of my mouth were, number one, the courts have a responsibility to deem constitutional, to presume constitutional, valid acts of the legislature. And number two, legislatures are not required to solve all of the problem at once. They can take incremental steps towards solving the problem. And I would submit very respectfully that the rational basis test, that is whether an assault weapon ban and a prohibition on high-capacity magazine is rationally related to the end of preventing gun violence, is sufficiently established by the testimony we've had here today, and that a decision by a court striking down the statute that's been proposed would be deemed constitutionally incoherent. You've used that word incoherent.
Could I just respond?
Well, you'll be given an opportunity to respond, but normally in hearings we allow everybody to finish.
I'm sorry.
And then you'll have a chance.
Excuse me.
You have used the word incoherent to describe the legislation that's been proposed here. I think that is, number one, disrespectful to the committee, but number two, I think it is just plain wrong. But number three, if you have suggestions for how to improve it, and this goes for any of the members of this panel, certainly we would welcome them, because our ultimate objective, which I hope you share, is to help save lives. The kind of carnage that has been described so eloquently by Mayor Nutter and Chief Flynn and United States Attorney General Walsh, not to mention by Neil Heslin and Dr. Begg, based on their personal experience. And as many articles as you and Attorney Hardy may have written, I don't think you have had the personal experience firsthand of seeing how dangerous, that's the word used by our United States Supreme Court, Heller, how dangerous these weapons are. And my hope is that perhaps you will be more supportive, because I think America is on our side on this issue, because America knows this time is different.
Could I respond?
Yes, you may.
So, and Senator, first, we're not on different sides. The thing that bothers me most about the debate is that it turns us against one another. We're all trying to figure out how best to be safe. My explicit testimony referenced the Army Joint Service Combat Shotgun Program report. And my point was, with respect to the incoherence, that the claims that were being made by the committee and others that justified the prohibited category were better descriptions of guns in the non-prohibited category, and the Joint Service Combat Shotgun Program report shows that. That is the incoherence that I'm describing. And that kind of incoherence, that is a classification whose justifications will not hold up, is the point of the rational basis review issue that I mentioned. The other thing to point out about the Heller decision is that it requires something far more than simply rational basis. That is, it's not an automatic deference to whatever the legislature does, because now what we're talking about is a constitutional right. So what we end up with ultimately is the Supreme Court potentially looking, or some court looking at this question, making a determination about whether these distinctions, whether the classifications between the AR-15, et cetera, and all of the things that are on the good gun list, whether those classifications are rational. And if the court ends up saying no, they are not, then what you will have is a piece of legislation that has accelerated in a dramatic way the purchases and the number and inventory of the very guns that you're trying to eliminate. And that seems to me to be a kind of unintended consequence that people should have an appreciation for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I recognize that we'll be evicted from this room, but I'm sure that we'll continue this conversation, and I hope it is continued constructively with that common end of helping to prevent gun violence and the kind of massacre that we saw in Newtown. Thank you, Madam Chairman.